Welcome everyone. We're gonna give people a few more seconds to log in and get in the room, and then we'll get started. All right, I think we're gonna go ahead and get started for the sake of time. So hello everyone and welcome to Washing Away History, Digging for the Future at Fort Mose. This is the second virtual panel in a two-part series on the past, present, and future of Fort Mose. I'm Laura Marion, the Collections Coordinator at Governor's House Library, and I'll be hosting today's virtual panel. We also have Kimberlyn Elliott, the Associate Director of the Lincolnville Museum and Cultural Center, monitoring the chat, and Casey Wooster, the Collections Assistant at Governor's House Library, assisting with behind-the-scenes tech. We all three use she, her pronouns. We're so excited you're joining us today. Washing Away History is brought to you by the George A. Smathers Libraries at the University of Florida, UF Historic St. Augustine's Governor's House Library, Lincolnville Museum and Cultural Center, and the Florida Museum of Natural History as a part of the Resilience Black Heritage in St. Augustine Collaborative Project. Resilience is a year-long exploration of Black history and heritage among cultural and academic institutions in St. Augustine. For more information on Resilience or any of our sponsoring organizations, please visit our website, which we will share in the chat. Before we get to our incredible speakers, we'd like to acknowledge that the lands we are presenting from and speaking about today are the ancestral homes of the Timucuan, whose stories are tied to the colonial systems that created and continue to shape Fort Mose and St. Augustine. After all, it is important to understand the long-standing history that has brought us to the land we reside on and seek to understand our place within that history. We encourage you all to learn about the Indigenous people, past and present, who call your areas home. You'll find the link shared on screen as well as in the chat box. And now it's time for a little housekeeping before we dive into this evening's featured programming. You will see a link in the chat to open up a web page. You'll also see it on the screen. You can type it into your internet browser and use that code to take a poll. And we would like to know what words or phrases come to mind when you think about Fort Mose. We'd love for you to add your thoughts to our word cloud through the link in the chat, and we will leave this open throughout the program and we'll share the results with the whole group later on. So while you're adding to this word cloud, we'd like to inform you all that we're recording this webinar. It will be available to watch via YouTube soon. You will notice that the audio, video, and some chat features are disabled. This is intentional to keep the focus on our speakers today. We encourage you all to submit questions throughout the program through the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. We will provide ample time at the end of our panel for your questions, and we'll try to answer as many questions as possible. In an attempt to give underrepresented voices a chance to speak, we ask for those who feel comfortable doing so to self-identify as belonging to an underrepresented group when asking a question in the Q&A or commenting in the chat box. Your questions and comments will be prioritized. So now we will begin with a brief introduction from our panelists. As I call your name, please introduce yourself and tell us about your connection to the fort and how you first became involved with Fort Mose. After everyone has introduced themselves, Thomas Jackson will give us a brief history of the site. So first we will have Dr. Kathleen Deagan. Kathy, you're muted.
Sorry about that.
No problem.
I'm an archaeologist and I'm retired from the University of Florida, but I've been working in St. Augustine since the 1970s and did excavations at Fort Mose in the mid 80s, about 35 years ago. So this project has been near and dear to me for a long time.
Next, we'll have Sarah Miller.
Hi, my name is Sarah Miller. I'm a director at the Florida Public Archaeology Network's Northeast Regional Center hosted at Flagler College. And that's where I work. Anything else I was supposed to add?
Yes, what's your connection to Fort Mose?
My connection to Fort Mose, it started with my interview with Kathy and her talking about, it was my interview for the job, and Kathy was on the job, what do you call that? Job search committee. And just knowing what a significant site it was to her early on, and I knew I had to get there right away. And I've had wonderful days. I had one day where I was chased by wild hornets all the way to US 1, and I've had very pleasant days out there. So doing a lot of education and outreach, and then turning more to heritage at risk and what are we going to do about sites, coastal sites that are at risk, and especially Fort Mose, such a significant site.
Awesome. And sitting next to her, we have Dr. Lori Lee.
Hi, I'm Lori Lee. I first was introduced to Fort Mose in 1998 because my dissertation advisor, Teresa Singleton, worked with Kathy, learned how to excavate from Kathy, and worked with Charles Fairbanks as well. And she published a book in 1999, I Too Am America, about archaeological studies of African American life. There's a very short 2-chapter section in that book on free block sites, which includes one by Kathy Deagan and Jane Landers, which talked about the significance of the site and how it was being impacted by climate change. So all of these things I was very excited about. And like Sarah, when I came to interview for my job at Flagler, I'm an associate professor of anthropology at Flagler College. When I left, I thought, well, if I don't get the job, I need to go to 2 places. I'm going to go to Kingsley and I'm going to go to Fort Mose. So I went to both of them. And so in thinking about field school opportunities, I wanted to I like to work on local projects and projects. And I had a collaboration with University of Florida professor James Davidson and one of his grad students, Liz Ibarola. We had been working on sites at Buglo Plantation, and we wanted to work in St. Augustine together. So we all have very specific research interests in the site, but we were all very interested in African diaspora work. So here we are, and we're in the middle of our field school. I left the field just a couple hours ago. So we're fresh out from Fort Mose, and it's just such an important, meaningful place and builds on the important work of everybody who you heard from last week and who's here today. So we're very excited to be a part of it, and our students are excited to be a part of it as well.
Thank you. And last but certainly not least at all, we have Thomas Jackson.
Hello, my name is Thomas Jackson. I appreciate being in this esteemed group here of archaeologists, and I'm a lifelong resident of St. Augustine. When I think about Fort Mose, I think about when we were growing up as kids, the elders would tell the story of we had a fort too. And I would think, well, wait a minute, where's that fort? But after going to school up in Tallahassee, history professor, Dr. Eaton, mentioned to us that, well, he asked each one of us where we were from. And when I told him St. Augustine, he said, have you ever heard of Fort Mose? So that's kind of when I first heard that name. And I really didn't, I didn't really do any research in it until I got back home and did some amateur research in the history books. But I've kind of, kind of got enamored with the subject. And I've been working with the Fort Mose Historical Society for about at least 25 years. So really, I know a lot about the story of Fort Mose, but I'm not a, an academician as far as the history and archaeology goes. So that's why I really feel honored to be in the group of these archaeologists that is doing the real work down in the dirt, so to speak. But at any rate, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the society and a little bit about the history of the society and how we try to help tell the story as well.
Would you like to share your screen with the video?
Okay, let's do that. And it worked better when we did this for practice, but let's see. Okay. Now, here you go. Is it coming through now?
We can hear it, but we're not seeing it.
Okay.
You may need just to reshare the screen.
Liz?
You stop share and reshare.
I'll stop share. Reshare.
You can see it now.
You see it now? How's that?
That's great. Thank you.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, how's that? Can everybody see that?
Yep. Got it.
This is basically the June 23rd, 1996, when the society was actually voted into existence. Most of the members of the organizing committee met at Fort Mose site. There was nothing at the site at that time. It was really undeveloped, and it was the only work that had been done out there was done by Kathleen Deagan and her crew doing some archaeological digs. I believe the crew from University of Florida came over, and also some other kids came over and did that dig with her. And it was early 1990s, 93, 92, 93. And the society was formed in 1996. Actually, it was formed June 26, 1996. And the idea was initiated by a park historian, the late Norm Edwards. He approached the Venetian Club of St. Augustine to assist in forming a citizen support organization to help tell the story of Fort Mose. The then Venetian Club president, Lorenzo Laws, encouraged the group to accept the challenge to form one of the first CSOs in the state of Florida. That's a picture of Norm we just passed, and that picture on the right. He's passed on now. The organizing committee was comprised of about 25 local individuals who met bi-weekly in the government house and at Anastasia Park headquarters for approximately 4 months. The chairman was a local attorney, Michael Bryant, myself as vice chair, and treasurer and secretary was Betty Riggin. After compiling the Constitution and bylaws at the bi-weekly meetings, the committee filed the paperwork on the 26th of June, 1996. And that date actually coincides with the 1740 Battle of Bloody Mose. So this year, 2021, is the 25th anniversary of the society. I guess there's a lot of information about Fort Mose that you can read on the subject. But then to us as members of the society and members of friends of Fort Mose, we like to think of this as a bastion of freedom, a site that was the site of the first free Black settlement in what is now the United States, but was at that time Spanish Florida. And it really represented a destination point for freedom seekers who made their way down from the Carolinas and lived here in Spanish Florida free. That picture on the left is one of the organizers of the group, Reverend F.D. Richardson. He and Commissioner Twine helped brought the idea of purchasing Fort Mose site and making it become a part of the Florida Park Service. There were some challenges along the way. The site was almost sold out from under us, but then the Florida Trust for Public Lands helped with the purchasing the site, and the St. Johns County came through with some unanticipated revenue to purchase the site, reimburse the trust for the money that they spent. So it's been a rocky battle along the way to preserve the site and save the site, even though there had been an archaeological dig there before that the society was formed. But a lot of work has gone into getting it done. And on February 13th, 2006, Governor Bush came and we had a groundbreaking. The groundbreaking was for the museum that's on the site now. And right now we've been telling the story ever since. Hopefully we can continue to tell the story. And even though the subject of this particular talk is about sea level rise, that story will be told, whether it's told with or without the site itself. But the site, we think, will definitely be protected as well as it can be protected. So at any rate, this is the story of the society and what it did to tell the story of Fort Mose. And of course, we have a lot of archaeologists, historians, and all that's continuing to tell the story. Okay.
Where did it really begin? For African Americans everywhere, what is the rest of the story?
That is part of another video that we don't have copyrights to, so forget you saw that part.
Thank you so much for sharing that history with us. For those of you who are interested in diving deeper into Fort Mose's history, we encourage you to visit the websites for the Fort Mose Historical Society and the Fort Mose Historic State Park, which I believe Kimberlyn has placed in the chat for all of you.
Good.
All right, well, let's get started, shall we? To kick us off, why don't we go back to the first major dig at the site, which began in 1986. And was led by Dr. Kathleen Deagan, who's here with us today. So Dr. Deagan, after the site had been buried for over 140 years, what factors realigned for the rediscovery and the excavation of Fort Mose? And what was it like to be working on this project?
Well, thank you. And thank you for that video, Thomas. That was really took me back. And the first time I worked at Fort Mose was when I was a graduate student at the University of Florida. And my professor, Charles Fairbanks, who Lori mentioned earlier, had been working at Kingsley Plantation. He was one of the very early pioneers on plantation archaeology, and he was really interested in Fort Mose, and he really wanted to try and find it. And we had a field school in Gainesville, and we went out for a few days, came to St. Augustine and tested that site. And he decided that probably was. We found the right kinds of artifacts, and it was in roughly the right place. But it was another 15 years before we could get funding or get support to go back out and really study Fort Mose. And that was in about 1985 when a legislative group came to St. Augustine to get a tour and look at historic sites. And among them was Representative Bill Clark, who was from Lauderdale Lakes. He was a Black legislator, and he was heard about Fort Mose on the tour and got fascinated. And he made it possible to get legislative support for doing that work. And so we began with Representative Clark and the field schools and worked there in 1986 and 1987. Can we have the first slide, Casey, that shows where the site is, just to give you a sense of the geography of the area? You can see, you see where the museum is. Those of you who are joining us, this can orient you. And the boardwalk where you can view the site, those weren't there when we began. And that line right through the center of the picture between the two dredged words actually is a scar from the path we made in 1986 and 1987 walking out to the site. And it was possible to walk out through the marsh then. And I know that that's marshes do not recover very quickly from something like that. So poor Lori Lee and her team have to take a much more circuitous route, which she'll tell us about. But the interesting thing of this image is it shows how Fort Mose really, in terms of climate change and vulnerability to sea level rise, really is starting with a handicap, because we know from the work of historian Thomas Graham at Flagler College that Henry Flagler bought this area in the late 19th century and dredged it to get soil to fill in Maria Sanchez Creek, which is now Cordova Street, and ironically under Flagler College. Much of that soil that was used to fill those marshy areas in came from this area. And you can see on the image, there's some pretty straight lines to the, I guess it would be your left of the bottom dredged word. You can see a little skinny strip of earth, and there's another one on the other side. Those are the edges of where the dredging took place. And the fort itself was miraculously left intact by Flagler. And it's over there by Second Fort at the edge of that little island. So it looks very isolated today, but at the time it was occupied, it really wasn't isolated. It was surrounded by land, and it was an easy canoe trip to the fort, probably just a couple of kilometers. But today it's a different story. So it was really an exciting project. There are a lot of logistical challenges of getting equipment in and out. And there was a lot of interest in it. But we actually stopped the dig a year early because you heard Thomas Jackson refer to the issues around the sale of the site. And there were some real political problems at that time between the landowner and the legislator and the community for that matter. And so we were removed from the excavation. Fortunately, the grant that we had allowed us to build an exhibit with the money that we still had remaining from not digging another year. And we developed this exhibit at the Florida Museum of Natural History, and it traveled the country for 11 years. And pieces of it you can see today in the much nicer exhibit that's in the Fort Mose Museum. Could I have the next image? The one of the, yeah, perfect. So our excavations, is the other half of it there? Anyway, we concentrated where you see the green shading on the end of the island. And we really had to show that this was in fact a fort, Fort Mose as it appeared on maps, because there was some local resistance to the site being here and being supported by the state. Casey, is that other part of the slide on there?
Sorry, no, it isn't.
Oh, the one with the contour map? Well, imagine, if you will, a contour map of the site. We did a map. There you go. Thank you. We mapped the site. That was one of the first things we had to do. And when the computerized contour map was made, we didn't do this ourselves. It was a program. It showed very clearly where the walls of the fort had been. And that's about, those contour lines are 10 centimeter contour lines. And it showed, you can see where the yellow is outlining on the island, the remnants of that fort. And you can also see that one whole corner of it is gone, and that's been eroded away. And that part of the island is still eroding. But our major accomplishment was really to locate the fort, get enough evidence to show that it was in fact Fort Mose, determine how it was built. And we tested some in the inside, but not as extensively as we would have liked to. We were really, of course, digging it to find out what life was like there and what people did, and how if the people who came from Carolina and founded it brought with them African traditions or English traditions, or did they adopt Spanish or Indian traditions? Those are all things we were really interested in. But the interior excavations were limited. We found some buildings in the base of maybe a watchtower, but we couldn't really answer all those other questions. And so I'm just really thrilled that Flagler College is continuing that work and is going to be able to focus on those kinds of things rather than the architecture of the fort. And we expect great things. I just want to end by saying that the two things that I think were the best that came out of our work, one was the history. Jane Landers was a student of mine at the time, and she went to Spain to look up, find anything we could about Fort Mose, and people always said, oh, there's no history. There's things weren't written about Black fugitives, but in fact, Jane found a wealth of information and has been writing about it ever since. And I think the other thing is just what Thomas Jackson was telling us, that it really ignited a community fervor of Black and white residents of St. Augustine. And it was really one of the first times I had ever seen that. And it's just grown to the present day. The society is really, I think, one of the best things that came out of our work.
Thank you so much. I learned a lot of things about Fort Mose from that I didn't know before. So as Dr. Deagan said, Flagler College and the University of Florida are currently working at the site to do some additional excavation, and Dr. Lori Lee is leading that, and Sarah Miller is also involved in that dig. So I would love for the two of you to talk about the current work that you're doing and what the objectives of this dig are, and some of the ways that it is similar and different from the original dig in the 80s.
Do you have the slide? All right, so to clarify, this project is this year, I mentioned Dr. James Davidson, who you see in the center photo, is a partnership with the University of Florida, Dr. James Davidson. And in the middle of that middle photo is Dr. Liz Ibarola, who will be starting her job at her tenure track job at University of Texas at Austin this fall. So the three of us are all co-principal investigators on this project. And it's been really great to work with a team of archaeologists at the site. And that means we can bring a larger number of students in, and that helps with this short time that we have for our field season. But our work would not be at all possible without our colleagues throughout Florida making it happen. So as Kathy alluded to, we do have a more circuitous route to take because of concerns about environmental protection. we are only able to access the site by boat, and that could be really expensive. So our partners at the St. Augustine Lighthouse and LAMP, the Lighthouse Archaeological Maritime Program, shuttle us back and forth to the site every day. And they are developing their own permit right now to test impacts of Hurricane Irma at several different sites, including Fort Mose. And they're going to do some underwater testing. And what you see in the other two images are two other FPAN folks that work with Zira, Emily Jane Murray and Emma Dietrich. And they are standing on a platform created by LAMP because that corner of the fort that has eroded into that tributary creek that you see there that Kathy mentioned is eroding even further and fairly rapidly. So we wanted to test that and see what has already been lost, what is being lost, so we could get a sense of climate change.
And that's today, fresh. This is fresh to you.
All these pictures are today, and notice how planned these folks were when they showed up, because Emma and Emily Jane have on FPAN, LAMP, UF, and Flagler College regalia. Thank you very much. We didn't have a University of Texas at Austin, but everything else is represented there. And what we are finding there is that we do seem to have lost, as you would anticipate, the top layers of the site. So what we're beginning to find in those, the topmost layers that are left are prehistoric ceramics, including Deptford, which is from Georgia and was only made until about 700 BC. So we're trying to document what happens with erosion to sites and what gets lost in the process. And with the help of our friends at FPAN and LAMP and the state parks, of course. So it really takes a village to do this project, and we're really grateful. And also the Fort Mose Historical Society. Thomas, I just wanted to say we are also very honored to be in this panel with you, and we appreciate all that you do and bring to our community and our students. They're so fortunate to meet someone who lives in St. Augustine and can talk about life here and how things have changed over time. And same with Kathy. I promised Kathy I would not be a fangirl, but we are so fortunate to work on this project that she's one of the many great projects she's developed in St. Augustine. So I'll talk a little bit more about what we're doing. Did you want to say something about these images? I'll have you move to the next slide. So one of the questions that I thought you might be interested in is what kinds of things we're finding and that we're interested in, and what do they tell us about the people? As Kathy mentioned, our research interests were really very much two things. Primarily, what was life like for this diverse community that lived out here? So you have Africans, you have African Americans, you have African West Indian folks, you have Native Americans, you have men, women, and children living at this fort. And Liz's work focuses on the aspect of the fact that this is a maroon community of folks who emancipated themselves. Some of my own interests are in medicinal practices. And so we were really interested when we found this part of a bottle, which is a part of a Robert Turlington's Balsam of Life bottle. We found this in 2019, and we're excavating in this area still today, literally today. What is really intriguing about this bottle is a few things. It's the first patent medicine bottle. So people didn't want to reveal the ingredients of what their medicines were. And there were apparently 27 ingredients in this particular bottle. But what they did then was make distinctive shapes of bottles. So Robert Turlington patented this bottle, this particular style, in 1754. So again, the Fort Mose 2 that we're interested in is occupied 1752 to 1763. And this bottle was patented in 1754. We got the really nice diagnostic piece, which never happens when you get bottles with letters on them, but it may be hard for you to read, but it's a Balsam of Life bottle. And this particular bottle is spelled B-A-L-S-O-M. So that is the American spelling of balsam. And in 1756, Robert Turlington has some ads in New York papers and Atlanta papers complaining that, no, not Atlanta, Philadelphia, I'm sorry, complaining that people have stolen his patent bottles and gone to the trouble of Americanizing them and are reselling them. So this is a nice, really interesting artifact from the time period that we're most interested in, but we're also interested in interpreting the periods before. The site is built right on top of a Native American shell mound, and the periods that came after. So certainly right now our students are in the era of, are excavating in the time frame of the British occupation period, just above the Fort Mose occupation. So it should get really interesting what we're finding next week. Next slide. So I could tell you a lot more about artifacts and what they tell us. There's another medicinal bottle in the far right corner that we found, an apothecary bottle, which could only be held upright in a stand, and it has scratches on the bottom from that stand. I just wanted to show you how excited and enthusiastic our students are to work on this site and what kinds of conditions they're working in. And they show up every day with those smiles on their faces and carry heavy equipment, make it out there, dig all day, and we're really grateful for them, and we couldn't do this project without them. So they're helping us answer some of those questions, like what was the interior of the fort like? Were the houses of the people who were working at the fort inside the interior? We're finding some features that help us understand that as well. So next slide. Okay, well, there's a slide in here of features at some point. I just wanted you to know that features are something that helps us archaeologically tell about things like where buildings, posts for buildings were in the past, so we can get patterns and understand more about how the houses were arranged, or the buildings or structures that were inside the fort were arranged. So we're building on the pattern of post holes that we found in 2019 with the units we're excavating this summer, and we'll be happy to come back and update you on what we're finding. But again, really personal items are things that are really important to us, and understanding people's lives and identities as they express themselves, as well as their lives as working as soldiers. So we find a lot of military artifacts, gun flints, and we also find glass beads that we know are important and significant, and particularly in one location for African diaspora populations. So they are used for many different purposes, not just to make you look better. I like this pretty necklace, but as a means of protection. Certain colors mean certain things. And most of the ones we have found are blue and colorless or clear. So we're very excited about that as well. All right, so I will let Sarah talk.
Oh, is there a question for me?
Sarah, do you have anything to add about the current work and
your monitoring? Yeah, I think how we get folded in on top of the education and outreach side is a lot of that education and outreach happened the last 15 years, you know, with the idea that development was a big threat, or people's just needing to be aware of the site, promoting the site. And now, of course, we know that the climate crisis is at a tipping point, and we need to be aware and having informed decisions and discussions now. So part of how we get involved is on the advocacy side, and training people to know the language of the climate crisis and how to inform decisions from the local community and from our elected officials or the task forces that get convened, so that they also know, in addition to all the things they're looking at, the cultural resources matter, that Fort Mose matters, and how to put these very sensitive sites on the radar. Because when you start talking access to fire departments, grocery stores, your house, cultural resources tend to fall aside. So we need to be working that much faster in how to address this Fort Mose. And one thing we do is we go out and monitor a site. So you just think of going to the bathroom at Publix, and you'll see on the back of the door a little monitoring form that said who was there, when was they last there, what needed restocking, what was the general condition. And usually they're just half filled out. They're like, why are we doing this all the time? But same for site checks. Even though you don't think a change has happened, every time you go out to a place like Fort Mose, it's just a little bit different each time you go out. So we get requests to go out, especially after storms or after there may be vandalism or reported impact to the site. And now we just try and go out annually, if not quarterly, if not more frequently, before and after storm events, because we can see the areas all around Fort Mose are having dramatic impacts. So you saw the image of Emily, Jane, and Emma doing photogrammetry, so we can 3D replicate the shoreline, but also use that as a baseline for comparison and get something more to the volume of what we're losing, because it is very difficult for people to say that, especially if they haven't been keeping those baselines all along. Or we'll go out to monitor a site and the state is like, you were just there a year ago, why do you need to go back? Well, your line of erosion is not going to be very complete if you don't have multiple points of data. So you can say, wow, we lost 9 feet in one storm, is a lot different than, you know, I don't know, I'm not sure, and you're just losing it fast. So we're trying to be able to quantify. We do the monitoring and we engage the public to do that. The other thing we do is arrow mapping of the shoreline, just walk the shoreline. And one of the devices we have now, it used to be a 30 centimeter accuracy, and now it's within 3 centimeter accuracy. We can walk the shoreline, which is a very pleasant thing to do, use volunteers to do it, and then compare year to year. So we've done that across the river over at the Guana Preserve. And in some areas, we've lost 5 meters in 1 year. And some of that was also due to tree fall. But now instead of guessing, we can demonstrate and show and again, quantify that work. There's some slides for the climate change. I'm not sure if they're there yet, but let's do them now so we can not miss them at wrap up. If you have, do you have the map image? Oh, thank you. And they're at the end, so I don't know if we're
So
there
I'll
yet.
just say that,
Just one, oh, sorry.
Oh,
yeah,
Oh,
and the other thing I was trying to pull up was the storm surge zones, because we can lose more in a storm surge than we could from the slowly encroaching sea level rise. So I just picked the 6 foot level just to pick one, but there are impacts at 2 feet, 3 feet, 4 feet, starts to split the island until you are, as published in the promo for washing away, up to a foot of water by 2100. So how to watch those. And this is managed by Fort Mose Historic State Park. Anastasia, we have areas that are flooded in the 2 foot sea level rise scenario that are already flooded, like they are already have standing water year round. So we're not even looking at a prediction. We are looking at the current is at the 2 foot rise level. So that's why it's important to get out there and to see them. Can you see the impacts? Can you see the impacts of sea level rise?
she's sharing her.
Oh, yes, thank you. So if you want to go to the previous image, and we'll throw to Kathy, what are we looking at with that stunning image?
oh, I just included that really as another illustration of what Sarah Miller is talking about, who does much more involved in understanding rising waters and sea level than I am. But this was a multispectral scanner, infrared, and a series of other kinds of spectra were combined in this map back in the 80s to try and we were trying to locate the village of Mose and possibly even the first fort, because the fort that everyone has been excavating is the second Fort Mose. The first one was destroyed by Oglethorpe in 1740, the Battle of Bloody Mose, which you can go out to Mose and see reenacted on first Saturday, is it, Thomas, every month? But one of the things that this showed, it says first fort, and there's a yellow square, and if you look really carefully, you can see a whitish double line in a square, and that's not natural. That is an artifact of some human or machine intervention. It just happens to be the exact dimensions of the first Fort Mose as it was described and the exact shape. And so we have concluded tentatively that that's probably where the original Fort Mose was, really just a short distance from the second Fort Mose, which we know about today, but it is underwater. I doubt that when Henry Flagler dredged this, he dredged it down to standing water. They just got dirt and they had to drive out. So it's still visible there. Well, that was 35 years ago, but it may well be lost by now. And that's really all I was trying to show for Sarah.
We had a good question of ideally what should be done to preserve. So I don't want to jump anyone's gun, but I bet you get some really interesting answers from this panel. TJ, what do you think should be done to help preserve the site? What makes sense?
You know, when the society started with the task of interpreting the site and trying to tell the story, when we went there, there was not much there to look at. So the first thing we would tell folks when they came out to, use your imagination. And it was an exercise in imagining yourself searching for freedom, and you finally find it. So, the site, the buildings, the structures, they are all fine and dandy, but it's the feeling of freedom and having that's the story we try to tell. And even though the tangible part of it is important because that kind of authenticates the story, what we try to tell is something that's a little more intangible in the spirit of freedom. So what we're talking about is really Mother Nature. I mean, so what can you do if Mother Nature wants to reclaim? All you can do is let her have it, and then move to higher ground. I mean, I'm not so sure what to say about that, but anyway, yeah. I think the story for us is more the intangible part of it.
I love that because a lot of your objects are also there at the visitor center, and you interpret the timeline from the Timucua to the Spanish to the and on, and so you have that continuity. And with the living community now, there's a lot of luck with living shorelines similar in that area, and they have tried some oyster shell restoration that took really well. It's just very slow going, and I think a foot of water is going to be really hard to deal with. So I think the excavations, the preservation through documentation is just fantastic because we wouldn't know. And then the living shorelines are excellent idea. And we have found a lot of earthworks that are surviving much better. Causeways. We recently found a rice dam that was preserved oddly in this totally blitzed out landscape. So there's still more to look at those more natural barriers, and then just acceptance. So I love, TJ, your story because those intangibles and what the community thinks of when they visit the site and they won't stop.
I don't want to get the wrong impression. I mean, I think we should try to save the site. In fact, the society, along with the Florida Park Service, did for at least 3 years, took oyster shells and shored up the shoreline along Robinson Creek, right where the site of the second fort. And as we did that, I guess a year or two later, it needed to be done again. So almost every year or so, it needed to be done, and we just wasn't able to keep up with it. But so I'm not trying to be pessimistic about it. It's just that if there was some kind of way that we could keep the erosion from happening and do it in a natural way, I think we should do it.
And we have an interesting hero to the rescue that our mangroves are migrating north. So maybe the mangroves will help
Okay, well,
site intact longer.
But it does seem, meanwhile, you're already doing some of the really important things like the 3D scanning and photogrammetry. Recording the site in 3D is,
yeah.
I mean, probably the best hope.
Well,
Yes,
it can be recorded for future historians to look back on. At least to know the story. I think that's important too.
And I think too, it's an important methodological approach in that we have a terrestrial component and that we're trying to work there. And we've got a wetland component that you saw in the image that they were working on today. And then LAMP is creating an underwater component. So I think in terms of costs, it's certainly much cheaper for us to excavate this now before it goes underwater anymore and document what's there for the future. But then they're also interested in exploring the underwater component as well. And there's some very interesting possibilities along that line as well. And I know, Thomas, you're interested in the waterways too, philosophically, as well as in terms of material culture that comes from them. How were the waterways used by people to gain freedom? And
Well, you know, if you're at the Fort Mose site and you see Robinson Creek, it actually empties into the intercoastal. And if you wanted to get from Fort Mose site into St. Augustine at the Castillo, that was the quickest way to go was by boat. So you can get there in a shorter period of time than it would take a regiment of soldiers to travel over land. So we try to tell that story on site there, that by way of water was a quicker and more efficient way of traveling that short distance from the Fort Mose to town. And of course, that was strategic too for the military to know what was coming their way ahead of time before it actually got there. So that's also part of the story.
Y'all are making my job really easy, so thank you for that. So along the lines of what you all have been talking about, archaeology, I think, often shows how the previous generations adapted to changes of all sorts. And so I'm really interested in knowing how all of you envision archaeology and historical interpretation of sites like Fort Mose having to adapt in the future to work with the environment and, you know, to try to to try to work with the environment as it continues to change and sea level rise continues to impact places like Fort Mose and St. Augustine as a whole.
I think Kathy made a really important point when she was showing those dredging issues and talking about Thomas Graham's work, that Flagler bought that piece of land and dredged it to deal with climate issues where Flagler College is now. So one of the issues that we talked about working with North American Heritage at Risk is how do we prioritize sites and how do we involve stakeholders in the prioritization of sites? And so certainly when Henry Flagler was doing that, this area, people weren't interested in this area in the same way that they are today. Or even when Kathy was working in the 80s, people were more interested in the British occupation of the site. And some people were more interested in, certainly not Kathy and her colleagues. And so I think that's an important part of the story that we tell in looking at how the site that we're looking at has been adapted over time as a result of people dealing with climate change issues over time. And then the issue that Thomas just brought up about all the boats coming through, it was the quickest way to go through. Well, now that we have power boats going through, they are throwing up really strong wakes that are continuing to impact the erosion on the site today. So, you know, if there was some way to reroute some of that boat traffic, that might help as well in terms of preservation.
You know, I was going to add what Lori mentioned, Nahar, North American Heritage at Risk, and I put the link, I think I did, in into the chat, but it's a suggestion of a pipeline that integrates the modeling, but the monitoring and then meeting with the stakeholders in the community to really form the research questions and be highly collaborative and understand the land use and the many different facets of it, to be partners then in the excavation and then mitigation. But mitigation doesn't always mean full excavation, and that could go into interpretation. It could go into story maps. It could go into virtual Fort Mose. It could go into other ways that you recognize that loss is happening. But the important thing is that a decision has been made, and in conversation with the community leading that conversation. So I think that's what's going to need to change, especially with interpretation, because we don't want to find ourselves 100 years later with sites nobody cared about saved. we need to make sure we are taking a good inventory and prioritization, and then doing what we can with the places community.
What can be saved? Some sites probably just can't, and that's an awful thing to have to say. But I think one of the challenges going forward in interpretation particularly is not just environmental but social. And every interpretation of every archaeological site changes as social values change, as we value different kinds of things, as we learn more from history. And I think today, I mean, just the fact that Fort Mose, we're here doing this for Fort Mose, is a real testament to that. But and of course, as you were saying, Sarah, the developing interpretation with stakeholders is critical, but the stakeholders in the future may not be the stakeholders of today. So you have to always keep in mind not to be too permanent in any kind of exhibit.
You know, when you mentioned stakeholders, Kathy, that's something that the Fort Mose Historical Society has attempted to try to form relationships over the years. And if you follow me on this for a minute, the site is actually located within the city of St. Augustine. The land is owned by St. Johns County. Mm-hmm. It's managed by the state of Florida Department of Environmental Protection. It's located within the Gullah Geechee Corridor Heritage Corridor, which runs from North Carolina down to St. Johns County, Florida. It's a National Historic Landmark, 1994, that's with your help, Kathy. And so it's the UNESCO site of memory for the international slave trade. So if you think about all of those stakeholders, there should be some interest in keeping Fort Mose site, at least not, if it can't withstand the forces of nature, at least the idea and the concept to stay alive.
Yeah, it's a great testimony that the public largely cannot visit the site. I mean, it is already a site inaccessible, that you have to enjoy it through interpretation that's on the panels at the end of the boardwalk. So that part will very much continue.
You have to use your imagination.
Yeah, and building off of that, Sarah, you mentioned earlier the fact that scientists have estimated that Fort Mose and the surrounding area may be under 1 foot of water by 2100. And as Kathy mentioned, you know, the stakeholders of today are not necessarily the stakeholders of tomorrow. So I'm really interested in hearing about some of the ways that you all think that engaging the public, especially younger generations, has been effective, and some of the ways that you plan to try to do that now and in the future to, you know, to make sure that they are learning about the history of Fort Mose and advocating for the preservation as much as possible of this really critical site in St. Augustine.
Yeah, it's already much easier now than it was a few years ago. So that's a tremendous switch that got flipped. We're doing another research project across the river, and one of the things we were asked to look at was the contemporary Asian fishing population. And I thought, well, this is going to flex my anthropological skills, because, you know, I'm used to looking at the 200-year-old historic site, the 6,000-year-old now taking that thread up through today, and TJ mentioned the Gullah Geechee corridor. Fishing is such a significant part of that heritage and that coastal heritage in that community. So as they have shown resilience and persevered, I have no doubt there will be Gullah Geechee fishing in that area, whether Fort Mose is filled over or not. So I think that cultural continuity is so important, and it's exciting to think of what future Floridians we may have. They may have to be visiting for more inland sites to come back out here.
And I think those stories we can really, in the way that Kathy and Darcy have done, and Jane, just really putting together really evocative exhibits and that are material culture based, because again, you can use your imagination a little better if you have some touchstones. So if you've got a few objects to build on, that can really help. And so we could, we're certainly finding lots of remains of fish as we're excavating, but we're finding remains of other animals too. So we can talk about the diet, what people were eating and what kinds of food would have been traditional, and make those connections with foodways that people were important to people in the past. And I think kids can get really excited about that because they know about the, compare it to the traditions that they have in terms of family holidays and what they eat for family holidays, and making those connections and making it relevant for them, and showing them, helping them make those connections through the histories that have been pulled together and the material culture that's been pulled together, and then the location, the museum that's on site, and the historical society. So and people like Thomas coming in and talking about what it's like to grow up in this area, what it means, and the significance, the local significance, national significance, and international significance of this site. So the stakeholders certainly approach all those groups.
Well, sort of building on what Sarah just mentioned, that really this is a place people are excited about without really seeing it, without really going there and being there. So it really is this story. So I would, and that can be interpreted, and the meaning of the story can change as people change. But so I think it's incumbent on archaeology and heritage to just record as much as possible of this without necessarily attributing meaning at the moment to it, and just record the structure of the site, what's in it, learn the kinds of things that Lori and her team are learning, and have that as a base for the future interpretation and reinterpretation of this story, because everybody is fascinated by it that I've ever encountered, and amazed they didn't know about it.
Yeah, and it's
one of the other things we're doing is putting the material into open source database, the Digital Archaeological Archive of Comparative Slavery. DAX. We can put that link in there too. So what that means is, as Kathy was saying, we're going to get the data. We're going to just put the data in there without any of our judgments. The site reports, all of that will be in there too, but people can just use the data to make their own interpretations if they want to. So it's open source, it's free, available to everyone. So that's one of the other projects that we're working on.
I was going to say, in the heritage at risk community, there's a lot of analogies to the burning library. And just the fact is, the future research of Fort Mose, people are being born now that will be doing their PhD on Fort Mose from the data collected by Dr. Deagan, by Dr. Lee, and the others. So getting some funding perhaps for that preservation of their state-owned artifacts, although there's some, as TJ mentioned, the complicating factors of ownership and who owns what. But I think that should be another focus too, for preserving the heritage, the research potential, but also making sure that they're safe. I mean, right now, where are the Fort Mose collections? Are they in Gainesville?
Yes.
Yeah, they're at the Florida Museum of Natural History.
That's great, because a lot of the collections go to, for the state, go to Tallahassee, but their Gainesville is a good place to be.
You know, the city of St. Augustine had this problem a few years back. I guess it may be 50, 60 years back. And the seawall was built, and that kind of helped, I guess, to hold back some of the erosion down on Avenida Menendez and down in the city. So I'm wondering if maybe something like that may be done. And I don't know if that could even help, but that might be a question, I guess, for environmental protectionists or engineers or that kind of folks.
Cofferdam, just cofferdam the whole thing.
Well, yeah, I'm not sure just what the answer is, because like I said earlier, I mean, if Mother Nature wants to reclaim something, she's going to reclaim it. But to kind of hold it back for a little while and let the interpretation take its course for a number of years, that might be worth funding and looking into.
Well, if they could move the Hatteras Lighthouse, they could certainly cofferdam.
Okay.
We're gonna need a lot more oysters. Let's get on there. It's so exciting because a couple years ago, digs were not happening out there. So it was very pie in the sky to think, man, we really need to look at these sites because again, the sea level rise will come and we have that time storm surge. You could crack that island in half in a certain storm. So just being prepared and ready, and that's fantastic that the field school is out there and that has come together.
Yeah, well, you know, you really don't want to diminish the efforts of the archaeologists because, you know, when one person finds something, they may look at it one way, but if you show it to somebody else, they may see something totally different. And it's what you're actually looking for, which makes the difference as to how something is interpreted. So I just applaud you guys to keep it up, keep the good work.
TJ, there's a nice comment in the chat about a historic preservationist. Hi, Michael, who's interested in attitudes towards possible recreation of the fort, not on site, but in a different location. And we were also wondering behind you, is that a future schematic for another phase, or is that the current visitor center? And maybe what the future is of that or a possible replica?
Well, the society is in the process of raising funds to build a 1738 representation of the fort. And we're about, I'd say 80, 90% towards that goal. We don't know what that first fort looked like, but we did discuss it with quite a few historians, archaeologists. In fact, Kathy was one of them, Herschel Shepard, Jane Landers, several other folks, and Richard Shortledge. And we came up with a concept, and that concept we want to build on the site now. The land is pretty high and dry. I would think that maybe the Fort Mose site that they're talking about being underwater in 2100 is different, I think, from where the actual museum is now. Where the museum is now is a little higher. So hopefully, now I'm not a topographer.
You're good for 5 feet. You got 5 feet, guys, and then may need to level up, make it amphibious.
Okay, but the thing is, you know, that's what we're really trying to get that done, because even if it lasts for 2100, which is, you know, we'll be talking about 60, 80 years, then I think that's enough time to tell the story and get a good foothold into that story. But to mention the drawing behind me is a drawing by Nancy Christensen. She drew this back in, I think it was 1997 or 98 as a concept for the building that's there now. The building was, well, the groundbreaking was 2006, and it was finished, I would say, it was finished during that year, 2006, because it was February when the groundbreaking took place. This is the idea that we pitched before the state of Florida, and we wanted the building to look similar to this. And we got, I say, close to what we wanted to have as a society with the constraints of the state of Florida, building codes and so forth. So I guess sometimes you have to kind of put the dream together. And when you put it together, you try to get as close as you can to it. And hopefully it'll come out to where it tells the story the way you'd like it to be told, without being too specific.
Yeah, for those who haven't been there, it's an incredibly tactile place as well. There are panels that you can touch the artifacts and touch the braille and different components. One day we drove up there to see them and we thought they had been stolen and they got reported stolen, but turns out it was someone doing some repairs to the panels. But it was shocking to see them gone, but it was for a short time. They probably thought no one would notice, but there was a huge outcry of people freaked out. It's lovely. It's beautiful to visit.
All right. Well, we are going to wrap up the panel portion of the event soon. But before we do that, I'm going to ask one final question. And I promise it will be an easy question. What is one thing that each of you wish everybody knew about archaeology?
Well, I wish everyone knew that archaeology is about dirt stains and not about artifacts. If that makes sense.
Yeah, you have to be able
It's
to.
not about finding stuff. It's about learning the context and what went where into the ground and recorded.
Well, as an amateur historian and I'm not an archaeologist, I just like to say it's a window into the way we were at one time.
So we are getting caught up in a rainstorm, if you can hear the audio. So I wish you knew, we like to plan ahead. For me, archaeology is about people and people at any time. So it could be 6,000 years old, 50 years old, 2 years old, unborn, about people. And it's a process. It's a process like all major things in life. It takes a lot of time to piece lifetimes together.
Yeah, I think that too, that people would understand that archaeology is anthropology, and it's about what we can learn about people from understanding how to read the soils and the artifacts that people leave behind, what that tells us about the people. And that archaeology is not just about digging, that process is continued in the lab. So there's so much more to that discovery process that doesn't only happen in the field.
Yeah, heads up, because on your list, we picked that one as like, oh my gosh, what are you going to answer for that one? Well, I don't know. Let's hope it gets buried.
Those were awesome answers, and I appreciate all of your wonderful insight and your expert knowledge being contributed to this event. So before we move into the Q&A portion, we're going to have a look at the word cloud that all of the attendees contributed to during the event to see what words they associate with Fort Mose. Thank you to everybody who added to this. So yeah, lots of freedom, resilience, community, heritage, lots of good words in there. And I think you all touched on it in different ways, how much of a community effort and project Fort Mose has been, both in the archaeology and in the interpretation of the site. And we are certainly very lucky to have a site like this in our backyards. All right, so I am going to pass the mic over to Kimberlyn now so we can hear some questions from the audience.
All right. Before I get started, I want to say thank you so much to our panelists. I really enjoyed this, and I've been monitoring the chat, and the audience following along has been loving it too. So thank you again for your time. We have a question from Charlene that I think might have been hinted on. I don't quite recall, but I will ask it. Have any vertical markers been placed in the landscape to frame the view / sightline to Fort 1 and Fort 2?
In the landscape, there's just a, you're muted. Oh,
Probably not. I mean, I suppose you could do that from the boardwalk, just sort of line up as a sight line to see where the first fort might have been. Would have to be pretty deep to stay upright in the mark, but it's a good idea.
you'd have to make it pretty tall too,
Yeah.
because great from the panels, you can kind of orientate yourself, but the tree lines are what they are. So if you were trying to get anything higher than the tree lines, it's flat, pretty flat.
Alrighty. So I actually have a question for Lori and Sarah and Kathy. So you all submitted some images of features, and so we want to pull those up on the screen if anybody is not familiar with what a feature is. So Kathy mentioned that archaeology is about dirt stains more so than artifacts sometimes. So I think if you could kind of share with us, yes, a lovely feature, and what do you see when you look at this, and what does this tell you?
Those are your dirt stains, aren't they, Lori? From your, I mentioned that because having worked at places, not Fort Mose, but at, say, the Fountain of Youth Park, and with hundreds and hundreds of school kids going by, their first impulse is to wonder if you found any gold or found something. And it's interesting to explain to them that we read the dirt, the different dirt colors and outlines really are like almost words or paragraphs for an it's what you train to do when you train to be an archaeologist, is to read the dirt. And that's what we were I was mentioning. But if I saw this, Lori, the one on the right, I would say first, maybe a grave.
Yeah. So
But
I put that one in there because it's most obviously a feature to people who don't know what features are. You can really clearly see the dirt stains there, that there's an area that is geometrical and it's different soil colors and different soil textures. And then it's the same feature in both images. I wanted you to be able to see we also look at the profiles, as Kathy was saying, of the soil as we're going down. So we're looking at how the soil changes as we're digging down. What kinds of, is there more sand? Is there more silt? What are the inclusions? Is there charcoal, more or less charcoal? Is there more or less shell? What kind of shell? That kind of thing. And based on Kathy's work and reading her reports and understanding what she was doing, we were really fortunate to go out after her and know at about where we would find the very thin ephemeral layer that is Fort Mose. And it's demarcated by two different, a difference in type of shells. So then we have, so the feature where it's making an appearance there, I can't read how deep down that is right there on our sign, because I need
60 centimeters.
60 centimeters down. So that actually went from 60 centimeters down to 94 centimeters. So most of our soils are culturally sterile, no evidence of human activity at about 70 centimeters. So this was something that was specifically dug down into the soil. And that happened at the very end of field school last year. And we have our students right now processing all the soil samples that we took from that, so we can understand the time frame that we're talking about and how that may have been used. So and as I was saying, archaeology is not just about what you're seeing in the field. We've taken these soils inside, and based on all the documentation that we've done, and now screening these through, water screening them through 4 different size sieves, understanding what the environment was like, what sorts of artifacts there were, what kinds of things people were eating. and what this feature may be related to. And that's in the area of the site where the site is eroding very heavily. So it's in the area where the southwest corner is approaching. So we are still interpreting that at the moment. But we put in a unit to help interpret that adjacent so that we can catch the other corner of that feature and see what it connects to, if anything.
Where did it start, Lori? Up in the shell, do you think, or is it just under the shell layer?
It did start in the shell. So again, we record as we go. And so the students who were working there, they didn't notice changes in color so much as soil or the changes in the type of shell. But what happened in that particular area, about 40 centimeters up, which is where our Fort Mose occupation layer is in most of our units, the soil started getting much, it was in that particular area, it was wetter, right? So there was a different texture to the soil. It was, the water was differentially deposited into the soils in the feature and outside of the feature. So the texture was changing. So yes, it did start earlier, but we didn't see that color difference that was so obvious until 60 centimeters.
Hey, let me ask you a question. Or we have a description of the site, that the actual site, it was made out of earthen walls. Yeah. So how do you tell the difference between earthen wall and a natural hill or something like that? I mean,
the contour map that we showed earlier helped because it shows where all the rises and dips in the ground surface are, and it showed this shape that was exactly the same shape as Fort Mose showed up on the Arredondo map, and it also measured the same distance, 65 varas on a wall. So that if it's just a random dip or the earth, it usually doesn't form a pattern that is regular and predictable, unless it's been interfered with.
Okay.
For example, up above the yellow outlined contours in this map, something else is going on up there, but it does not look regular. I think we did a few tests there, but that's probably more something more natural that you're thinking of. We were mentioning.
And all I have to add is that features can be tasty. I put in the chat, or I hope I did, that lesson plan we did on edible Fort Mose using the plan view and profile of one of Dr. Deagan's excavations, and had fun with it. And doing reverse stratigraphy activities is a great way to teach people, especially as the well intrudes into the lower levels. You really got to build it up backwards to have it done right. Also, invite me back to share my Kingsley Christie's recipe.
Yes.
Thank you, Sarah. I'm taking a look at that. I'm kind of mad because it's dinner time and I haven't had anything yet, and that looks so good. We had another question from Antoinette. When a site becomes inundated permanently, does the ownership change?
That's a really good question, because the state owns the bottomlands. There are really weird things about St. Augustine, though, where the city does retain ownership, unlike most cities, because of maybe Kathy can explain why that is. I think it even goes back to the Spanish land grants. So I think Fort Mose falls out of that area for the city, but you know, it's something interesting with when we have low water marks, and I'm not sure if Antoinette is Tony Wallace, but if it is, she would well know that we get a lot of reports of canoes that are coming out of lakes because the lake levels are dropping. And when the water levels come back, if it's a navigable waterway, it is the sovereignty, it's part of the state's sovereign lands and is managed by the state. So if you paid attention as Lori mentioned earlier that LAMP is involved. It is a separate permit. It's separate bureau departments doing the underwater versus the terrestrial. So completely different methodology. And we tried to get underwater components add to our terrestrial permits, and it was just a no-go. So they do get separately aligned, and what would be state land would still continue to be state land in that area, but maybe even neighborhood areas. It'll be interesting. Some of the it's on the other part of the state, but just a quick example, because this could happen in St. Augustine. Shipwreck, the Dog Island shipwrecks rolled in one of the storms. So usually you think of a storm disturbing the shipwreck and taking it further out to sea. This one kind of came up further on shore and on land, but since they had been owned and managed and permitted by the state for so long, there was a good question, like, do they still own it now that it's not underwater? And they probably don't. So that's going to come more into play as the sea levels rise. They're going to own more and more.
Wow, that's something I had never thought about. That was a really interesting answer. Thank you, Antoinette, for asking that. We have one final question, kind of putting into context Fort Mose, I guess, both historically and archaeologically, if that's a word, with other sites across Florida, the US, and maybe the Caribbean, maybe other maroon sites that were kind of formed around the same time period. Yeah, just what are any similarities or differences that you may have found in your studies or in your work?
Well, I'll jump in. I think the fact that Fort Mose is now listed by UNESCO on the whole slave trade and escape theme is an indication of its real importance, not just locally, but actually globally. And one of the interesting things that Jane Landers wrote about Fort Mose early on was that it really is a part of a Spanish tradition that happened throughout Latin America and other areas where enslaved people, Indians and Africans, would escape from plantations. And eventually the Spaniards just said, well, we'll make a treaty with you and you can be free and we'll make an arrangement. So it's kind of part of this whole movement that was happening from the 16th century onward in America South, but certainly not in North America. So it's interesting in that sense.
You know, Dr. Anthony Dixon down at, well, he was at the University of Bethune-Cookman, but I guess he's doing some freelance work now. But anyway, he did some research on the Maroon Society and a lot of the folks who really came down from the Carolinas, the freedom seekers that came from the Carolinas and came to Fort Mose. Not all of them decided they wanted to become Catholic and defend the city. Some of them decided they wanted to go into the hinterlands and team up with the Native Americans. So you see a lot of the type of what we think was Fort Mose structure, the thatched, chosas and stuff like that we have at Fort Mose. We see it throughout the South and especially in the Tampa area. And of course, I'm not sure where or how that developed that way, but I'm pretty sure that it was all just carried down through tradition and custom, and it was the best way to live at that time. So there's a lot of similarities between the Maroon societies, especially down by the Tampa area and in the Bahamas and with the Fort Mose society.
We had the honor of last year, the Caribbean Heritage Network came to visit, and it was sponsored through the Office of American States, and they brought individuals working in heritage tourism here and wanted to see the sites. And we knew Kingsley, Fort Mose, got to get them there, and then everything else would be fantastic. But those were our musts. And one thing I learned from them is that, you know, a lot of their beach tourism is starting to dry up a bit because people want to do more than just visit the beaches. Also, their beaches are starting to change and get impacted. So I think they were just blown away by the visits to the sites. And they just said, you know, where we are is a lot of it is still plantations with hoop skirts and teas happening. Like they have, they felt a long way to go, but such a significant part to really explore and interpret their coastal heritage, and the economic benefit through tourism, explore that as well, authentic sites.
Awesome, thank you. Well, that concludes our Q&A for the evening. Thank you everyone who submitted questions.
Thank you, Kimberly.
You're very welcome.
And a big thank you to all of our panelists for all of their insight and the amazing discussion that we had. We really appreciate your generosity and your willingness to participate in this conversation with us. Before we sign off, I would like to once again thank the Lincolnville Museum and Cultural Center, the George A. Smathers Libraries, and the Florida Museum of Natural History for working with us to bring you this wonderful event. And I would love to thank everyone who attended tonight. We hope you enjoyed this evening of learning with us. Please be on the lookout in the next few weeks for the recordings of these videos, which will be up on the Smathers Libraries YouTube page. And share them with those who couldn't be here tonight that you think might be interested in learning more about Fort Mose and archaeology. And with that, we will conclude the evening. Thank you to everyone. I hope you have a wonderful evening and a wonderful weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Viva Mose.
Bye.
Thank you.